Okay, good evening and welcome to the Medieval Times Dinner and Tournament. Actually, that is a real thing. In Canada, in Toronto, I'm sure they have them in every major city in the United States too. You can go and have the medieval experience where they have a tournament and there's knights that you cheer for you and you eat chicken with your hands and drink wine out of goblets if you're old enough. That kind of thing. Big cups. Goblet is a big metal cup. Kings used to use them. Sometimes they'd be made of gold or silver. I think this lecture is important because most of it is not in the textbook. So I'm going to set this book aside and talk to you about sort of this is like a in-between lecture. It needs to go into the textbook, but it hasn't made it there yet. So I will explain what's on the board in a general sense, and then I'll go back and go through step by step. One of the problems with English history, or Korean history for that matter, is that there's so many kings, and you get tired of remembering their names. Luckily, or unluckily, Koreans usually have different names for each king, although they sometimes are very similar, like Taejo or Sejo or Sunjo or Sejo. Unfortunately for us, there's 8 Henrys and 8 Edwards, 9 Edwards. We can't remember all of them. I try to, but it's really, this is a cultural studies class, not a history class, first of all. And I don't think it's that important necessarily that which number they are. But the fact that they keep repeating the names is important. I told you, John here, there's only one John. So you don't have to worry about that. There's only 2 non-repeating names, Stephen and John. And they both are involved in this part of the story, okay? So there is a line of kings that basically rule England in the medieval period. They're called the Plantagenets. I just finished a great book by Dan Jones about them, about their family. I read it in the winter vacation, so most of this stuff is not in the textbook, like I said, because I wrote this book a couple years ago, the current edition, and I had not read Dan Jones' Plantagenets at that point. So we talked about in class Richard, and Richard is one of the most important kings simply because he tries as much as possible to be the legend, right? The Arthur, the King Art, the actual manifestation of King Arthur. Henry II, his father, is like that too. So this is kind of just a map. Henry II, his wife, Richard's the next king, right? Richard I, and then John is not the first because he's the only John. And then Henry III after that. And then we get Edwards, the Edwards 1, 2, and 3 in a row. And then Richard II, but that's down the line. So really what this is, I'm trying to make this as simple as possible. Henry II, don't forget him, okay? Don't forget Richard, because he's the lion. He's the one who goes on crusades and, believes that he's the, reborn King Arthur, or he's King Arthur himself. And John is his younger brother, who is everybody hates, right? And Magna Carta happens because of him. And Henry III, you don't need to know about. I'm just putting him in there because he's not he rules for a really long time, but he's not very effective. And then Edward I becomes a Richard the First type person. You got the warrior king reborn again, and the warrior king Edward the Third after that, and in between you have another John. This Edward II is not popular, and I'll explain to you. This is very different than John, but Edward II is not very popular. And then we have certain people, Thomas Becket, who represents a lot of different things in English culture. So talk about him briefly as well. So let's start with Henry II. What happens is William takes over England. You know about the Conqueror. And then, so this Norman invasion, what basically happens is the Normans take over, but there's not that many of them compared to the people that they conquer. So eventually, sort of over this whole period of the Plantagenet rule, is by the end of it, you end up with Richard II, who speaks English as a first language and French as a second language. So it takes hundreds of years for the court to change its basic, structure and its reliance on French. But eventually it does happen, and the sort of the Normans become anglicized, right? They become English themselves, and they start speaking English as a first language, and being bilingual. And then by the time you get to Queen Elizabeth, the French it's non-native French, right? Long before Henry VIII and Henry VII will be still English language speakers and speak French fluently, but non-native. There's a difference. So they're the people in France will be like, oh, you don't sound like a French person, right? Henry II speaks French as his first language fluently. He's in France as much or more than he's in England. So over this whole medieval period, the most important thing is you have to remember that England is focused on France. For several hundred years, they were focused on the Viking territories. The Vikings have sort of their power and their influence has diminished. France is a mess, and England is really involved in France because a northern French Viking, William, took over England and made a sort of empire. Part of France and England together makes his kingdom. He's the Duke of Normandy and he's the King of England at the same time. Henry II is down the line. I skipped a little bit here, but basically what happens, long story short, is Henry I is the third son. And what William wants to do is give Normandy to his first son and England to his second son, and just give Henry I some money. This is the exact same situation that happens to John, because Henry has 5 sons, and Henry II will give land to everyone except John. So John will initially be called John Lack Land, which means a king with no land. A king with no land or a prince with no land is not really a prince at all. He's just a rich person, right? So Henry I is in the same situation. His older brother Robert, goes on crusade, and so he leaves, which gives him a chance to sort of steal Normandy from him. And his other brother, William II, dies in a hunting accident, which may or may not be the inspiration for Game of Thrones. If you've ever seen that, if you've never seen Game of Thrones, it's because you're too young and you don't know that it's one of the best shows that Americans have ever made. Probably the best show ever about realistic fantasy that Americans have ever made. It's not a movie. It's seasons. So you can watch Game of Thrones for 50 hours. So you can do a marathon for a week and still have more episodes to watch. But it's based on a later period called the War of the Roses. But this all sort of comes from this situation. It's hard for a king to have the right number of sons. It's, if you have too many sons, they fight each other. If you don't have enough, they die, and then you have a problem. Henry I has the second problem, which is his children die, and Henry I has to give the throne to his nephew. So it's the descendants of his brother. So Stephen, he becomes the king temporarily, but he's a terrible king. Things don't work out. His daughter gets married to a French sort of duke, the Duke of Anjou. They have a child named Henry. He ends up being the grandson of Henry I. So he goes to the nephew, and then the nephew, he has a son, but the son dies, so it comes back to the line, except for it goes through his mother, right? His mother's name is Matilda. Not on the test, though, okay? The blue is just for you to understand. This guy you need to know. Henry II was the greatest king of the medieval period, I think. One, because he married a woman who's one of the greatest females of the medieval period. I think that has as much to do with his greatness as anything else, because she was so... We don't have that many women in the course, and I think we need to mention some. Queen Boudica is probably the original British hero for females that led the revolt against the Roman, soldiers and men abusing their power. And Eleanor of Aquitaine was a super independent woman. Didn't like her husband, who was the King of France. So she divorced him and ran away and married the King of England. And then they had 5 boys together. There's a couple girls too, but I'm not sure. I don't know very much about them. The history doesn't really help us very much with the girls who are not her level. But she's into music. She loves poetry. She is the daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine. So when she marries Henry, suddenly, because she has no brothers, her land becomes part of the English territory too. So Henry II almost becomes like an emperor, because he has big pieces of France, some from his father, the Duke of Anjou, some from his mother, the Duchess of Aquitaine, former Queen of France. So he becomes this person who, because of people disappearing, dying, or fighting, he becomes this person who is brings all of these territories together. So he's in Ireland, and then he's in Scotland, then he's in England, and the King of France, who is his wife's ex-husband, says, one day he's in Ireland, one day he's in France, one day he's in England, one day he's in Scotland. You never know where he is. He's all over the place, which is pretty amazing, because there's no airplanes or trains or cars. He's just riding horses and moving all over the place. Despite the fact that they have a huge family, which is nicknamed the Eagle's Nest, because they're all eagles, Henry and her do not get along. It's surprising because they have so many kids. They must have got along for a while, but I don't know. Nobody knows exactly, but probably it's just, it was personality. He had a super strong personality, and so did she. So they ended up fighting each other, and Henry ended up fighting his children. But I think it's Henry that's mostly to blame for this sort of overbearing. He wanted everybody to listen to exactly what he said, and he was famous for his anger. So he would really, when people didn't listen to what he told them to do, he would really show his anger. Every famous leader has their personality, and Henry II's, his weak point, I think, was the anger he demonstrated towards his wife and his family and his friends who didn't do what he told them to do. It was, and when he did this, he would sort of lose control of himself. The stories are like he would go down on the ground and like start biting, the carpet, the rushes on the floor out of, sort of frustration. So he's got some strange behaviors, and it ends up being a civil war. The eagles nest, the eagles grow up, the baby eagles grow up, and they turn into eagles like him, and then they fight each other. And that brings me to one of the things that he had problems with was that he wanted to control the state, and he wanted to control the church as well. The church the power of the church is based in Rome, and it's a Catholic church. And as I told you before, in the medieval period, the church is like it's really, you have no choice. The community is based around participation in religion. So there's basically, the church supports a lot of the community activities more than the government does. The government is very small. The king and a lot of the king's friends, rich castle owners that are kind of, smaller versions of the king, dukes or counts or lords, whatever they may be. That's why, and in England they call them the barons. This whole group from the top to the bottom, they call them the barons. That's why John ends up losing control of the country. It's because the barons stop cooperating with him because of his behavior. So Henry II, he needs the cooperation of the barons, which he has, but he also needs the cooperation of the church. So in Canterbury, which we will talk about in a subsequent lecture, we'll talk about Chaucer writing the Canterbury Tales, which this is part of the reason you need to talk about Thomas Becket, is it is the origin story. Like, why do people go to Canterbury? Because that's where St. Thomas of Becket's shrine is. So they're on the way there to pray to this monument, to this guy who grew up and became an important person in Henry II's court. They became very good friends, and then when the Archbishop Thomas Becket was not a rich kid. He wasn't from a royal family or related in any way to a wealthy family, a Norman or anything. He was more of a poor boy who, through his ability, made it all the way up to be close to the king. He became the king's friend, and eventually became a minister in his court. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, the highest person in the church in England, Henry said, "Thomas, my best friend, buddy, fist bump, you go be the Archbishop of Canterbury, and, wink, wink, when I want you to do something, favor, just, do me a favor when I need it." So Thomas gets this job, which is, I guess you would probably say, second to the king, pretty much. So he thinks he's got his man, he's got his buddy, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is perfect. If he has a problem with the church, Thomas is just going to take care of it, right? I'll phone up my buddy and say, make this problem disappear. But that doesn't happen because Thomas Becket, for some reason, maybe religious reason, again, I think it's not 100% clear, but that's probably the reason, he becomes serious about being the archbishop. And when Henry does things that are not good for the church and against the religious belief of the church, he blocks him, stops him, and this causes Henry to freak out, yell, bite things on the floor, and complain about him, and they have a big feud. Like I said, he fights all of his children. John ends up being his favorite. Richard is Eleanor's favorite. I mean, it's just a mess. This is like a completely dysfunctional family. But that's going to be the common theme. I think there's two things about English kings that are important, kings and queens. One is they are dysfunctional. Their families are pretty dysfunctional, and they sometimes kill each other, or usually kill each other even. The second thing is that they're constantly running out of money. And this in a way is a good thing, because it requires the king to do things that other people want, even if they're rich people, like the Magna Carta. That's why the Magna Carta is so important, because it's the beginning of the process of the king respecting other people's needs or desires. And before the Magna Carta, they just don't. And Henry II doesn't. He's too powerful. He ends up fighting pretty much to the death against his own family, and then he dies. And then Richard becomes the king. So Eleanor, she gets locked up. Thomas of Becket, this is, rewind for a second. Henry II is not dead yet. Henry II and Thomas of Becket have this feud going on, and he gets banished. He's in France, and then he comes back, and they try to get along again, but they can't. And then one day, Henry is so frustrated and angry, he says, will nobody rid me of this turbulent priest? And everybody knows he's talking about the Archbishop of Canterbury. So 4 of his men, knights, they proceed to Canterbury, and they try to I think their object is to kind of kidnap him. So they try to grab Thomas of Becket, and I'll show you some slides to show you. There's no videos of this stuff, but there's some artwork. But basically, they try to pull him out of there. He's praying in the center of the cathedral at Canterbury. Basically, the most holy place. You know, if you're religious, you got to respect this place. And these knights come in there. Knights are not really known for, they pretend to be representing religion sometimes, but they're pretty brutal, you know, violent people. So they try to pull him away. He refuses to move, and then people start running. People hear, you know, the yelling or whatever, and him saying, "Help, help," or I guess it's in French, so it's probably "Au secours" or "Aidez-moi." I'm not sure what he said, but it was probably in French, although he was a poor boy, so it might have been in English or Latin, because he's a priest. But people started running, and they panicked. So one of the knights just took his sword, and like as he's like trying to keep his praying position, he supposedly cuts his head in half from behind. That's what the picture shows, is this knight like swinging his sword and cutting his head in half like a watermelon or something. And he dies pretty much instantly. If not, he bleeds out right away. And they run away, and he's dead, and his blood is all over the place. This creates the foundation for the first celebrity. You'd have to say. I mean, he becomes instantly famous across the entire continent. The Pope knows about it. Everybody knows it. People know about it in, you know, the others in Greece. People know it in Southern Europe, in Spain. Everybody knows what happened. The Pope wants to punish him, so Henry II, because of, you know, everybody, literally everybody in England and everybody in Europe knowing about it, he has to be whipped in public, which is a incredibly shameful thing for a king who thinks he has unlimited power to experience. But that's apparently what happens, is that a priest, you know, he has to take his shirt off, and they whip his back the same way that they would have whipped Jesus before he was crucified. So this episode is legendary, and the subsequent sainthood is very quick. It happens faster than any previous. Usually there's a certain period you wait before you declare somebody a saint after they die, but everything is sort of expedited. Everything happens very quickly, and he is declared a saint after his death, so he's representing heaven. Therefore, they build a shrine, they put his bones in it, and everybody in England travels there. If they can travel to Jerusalem or Rome or some other holy places, they would. But any English person in southern England could take off their shoes and walk with no, like pilgrims used to kind of make themselves suffer on purpose. They could walk 100 miles or 200 kilometers or whatever it was from their town and pray to St. Thomas. Yes, the St. Thomas Becket Shrine, it was there until Henry VIII destroyed it because he was a crazy guy, which will happen about 300 years later. But that's the story of Henry II. We already know about, we talked about this in class, Richard and John, which are in the textbook. And the Edwards, I think, that's how I will start out the next lecture, is talk about the Edwards, because the Edwards are involved with they're going to be the 13th century, they're going to be the beginning of the 14th century as well. They're going to sort of bridge into the 14th century, where the Black Death and the war with France becomes, everything for the future of England. And it's Edward the First that starts that sort of starts that argument, or that Edward the First is more focused on England at first, but by the end of his life, it's Scotland and England, and then Edward II basically ruins the whole effort and fails to take over Scotland. And then Edward III decides, we're going to focus on France, not on Scotland. So Edward is going to go sort of Wales, Scotland, France. Okay? Which is also not in the textbook really, except for the part about Scotland, which there are heroes and there are movies about Scottish independence. And this is the period Edward II is the King of England who tries to take over Scotland and fails to do that, which never again does Scotland is Scotland taken over by force. They decide by a vote to join the British Union in 1707, but they never get conquered the way that they were by other groups like the Vikings or previous groups. This is the end of the not the end of the invasions, but the end of the conquering of Scotland. So you can go to northern Scotland and you can find places like the Shetlands and Orkney where basically it's Viking culture still, because the English never managed to take over Scotland, and northern Scotland is more like Sweden or Norway and Denmark than it is like London. Okay, so that's one video out of the way. Stay tuned. There'll be a second one being uploaded soon. Thank you for listening.